The U.S. came out of World War II stronger economically than at any time in its history. By 1945, Americans were saving an average of 21% of their personal disposable income, compared to just 3% in the 1920s. Once the economy quit wartime conditions, people had money to spend. By 1948, Hollywood could make a movie about Mr. Blanding, whose salary is $15,000 a year, and who can design his own dream house, one with 4 bathrooms, for $12,500.
If we could just push out this wall a little and put in a built-in bar,
Excuse me, dear.
Huh?
These bedrooms are too small, and we'll have to have a little dressing room.
Yeah, and closets, Mr. Sims. Plenty of closets. If there's one thing this family needs, it's closets.
Yes, if I might make a suggestion.
And bathrooms, Mr. Sims. Each bedroom must have at least 1 bathroom.
Yeah, but that would be 4 bathrooms.
Just a minute, son. Just 30 short days. I'll dig up that 5,000 somehow.
Shut me up, shut me up.
Pop.
Just
Have you put any real pressure on these people of yours to pay those mortgages?
Times are bad, Mr. Potter. A lot of these people are out of work.
Well, foreclosed.
I can't do that. These families have children.
They're not my children. You take this loan here to Ernie Bishop. You know, that fellow that sits around all day on his brains in his taxi, you know. I happen to know the bank turned down this loan, but he comes here, and we're building him a house worth $5,000. Why?
Well, I handled that, Mr. Potter.
Down under 10,000.
That, I can tell you right now, is impossible. Even with considerable trimming of the things that you've indicated, I don't see how we can bring it in for less than 12 or 12,500.
12,500? Oh, well, I guess we're not going to quibble about a few pennies one way or the other.
Presidents Truman and Eisenhower retained the same high tax rate on the upper bracket. In the middle 1960s, Lyndon Johnson greatly expanded social spending. But Johnson also became obsessed with fighting a war in Vietnam, whose costs rose fantastically from 1966 through 1968. Wars cost big money, and Johnson feared the American public would turn against his war in Vietnam if he raised their taxes to cover the war spending. Instead of taxation, Johnson paid for the war by running up the budget deficit. But a deficit means greater demand on the money supply. Johnson was initiating a great inflation that in the long run would be very hard to defeat. But for a while, the optimism in America was clear.
The boss gets his choice of meals, a full meal or a diet meal. The boss is entertained with movies, stereo, and now his favorite television shows. The airline is United. The boss is you, the business traveler. You're a big part of our business, so he treats you like the important person you are.
By the friendly skies of United,
Where you're the boss.
Charge wants to give you all the clout you're working for. So when you shop, you can say,
I'm in charge.
that's real clout.
when you carry master charge, you carry clout.
I'm not president of the company yet, but I'm still in charge.
As late as 1970, a young person could graduate high school, apprentice at an assembly plant, and within 3 or 4 years, earn enough of a salary to buy a $17,000 home, support a family, and all with no college education. But by the middle 1970s, inflation was becoming a force and a threat, and discomfort and fear began to appear in the TV commercials.
Everybody's complaining about the business today. Okay, it's rough. But what are they doing about it? I mean for the customer. After all, he's spending the money. Well, this is a Sunoco tire store, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do about it. Mike, I'm going to do a lot more than those other tire stores who just sell you tires and never see you again.
The steel-belted radials at the top of my line. They're expensive. But when I recommend them to a customer, he knows he needs them.
We've been frozen in with a figure that was set in 1973, and we haven't been allowed to increase our profits any. And in the past 5 years, the cost of operating one of these places has more than doubled, and most of us are taking home less pay than we took home in 1974.
Governor Hugh Carey of New York told Congress today that default by New York City would be an economic Pearl Harbor for the rest of the nation.
West German Chancellor Schmidt came here and said the collapse of the world's financial capital could push the whole world back into recession.
In 1966, Ronald Reagan won the governor's race in California, campaigning against high state taxes and government waste.
No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size, so government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth.
Well, when government gets too big, freedom is lost. Government is supposed to be the servant. But when a government can confiscate the earnings of the people with no restraint or no limit whatsoever on the amount that government takes, then government has become the master.
When the economic times were good, many Americans could tolerate government spending programs for the elderly and the poor. But inflation and then higher unemployment began to arouse a panic, and nobody seemed to have a solution. In 1976, Jimmy Carter won the presidency by the votes of 2 large states, Ohio and Pennsylvania. These 2 states once employed thousands of unionized industrial workers making good pay.
Reducing the deficit will require difficult and unpleasant decisions. We must face a time of national austerity. Hard choices are necessary if we want to avoid consequences that are even worse.
Every morning at the Fed, he was greeted with dread. He stood 6'7" to the top of his head, green book in his hand and cigar in his teeth. Everybody knew you didn't give no grief to Tall Paul. Tall Paul, Tall Paul, Tall Paul Volcker.
To bring prices under control, Volcker, never without a cigar, choked off the money supply, driving up interest rates to discourage lending and borrowing.
So he tried a different tack, persuading them to focus on controlling the money supply. It was a sleight of hand, because the two are essentially the same. But it was a politically palatable tactic, and it worked.
And when he slowed the money growth rate, predictably, the interest rate went way up.
Neither he, nor I, nor anyone else had any idea of how high the interest rate was going to be.
8% to 9% to 10%.
15%, 18, 19, 20%.
21%.
Volcker.
Absolutely.
Volcker told him, Mr. President, you've tried everything to deal with inflation. Nothing's worked. I'm going to squeeze it out of the economy the hard way through high interest rates, which he never complained about during the election.
But the economy got worse. And in 1979, President Carter rejected an appeal from a small group of steelworkers from Youngstown, Ohio, who needed a modest federal loan so they could purchase the local steel plant and keep it running rather than see it closed for good by the company.
U.S. Steel decided to close its main steel plants in Youngstown, Ohio. It was a steel town, like other working class towns like Detroit. It had actually been built by the working classes. It was their town. They didn't get the profit because they were tools, but they built it. They wanted to keep it. U.S. Steel wanted to sell it, to close it down, and the union offered to buy it.
Last winter, the U.S. Steel Corporation shut down this mill in Youngstown, Ohio. They said it wasn't profitable. Today, some of the workers from the Ohio mill are trying to buy the plant and run it themselves. They are particularly bitter because they say they gave up some of their pay and then broke production records on a promise from U.S. Steel to keep the plant running as long as it made money.
Carter had been advised that steel production in the U.S. was no longer warranted government investment. The voters of Ohio never forgot Carter's refusal to lend the workers in Youngstown a hand.
I think what's happened really is that people are trained to assume that there is a source of money in Washington, D.C. that needs only to be turned on in order to cause hospitals to materialize.
Well, I think, as this gentleman said, you're turning the clock back, and you're reaching a position which is not acceptable in our society, and therefore I don't really think is helpful in solving the tax problems we do have.
No. This simply has to do with the recovery of a philosophical insight, one of which, it strikes me as basic, is that people ought not to be singled out as a class to be penalized as a result of the fact that they want to work harder or that their work is put a high premium on by society.
Or inherited more.
Or inherited more. Well, if we're producing less steel than we were 10 years ago, but still have relatively full employment, mightn't it be that it's a misallocation of American energy to produce as much steel, that we are more efficiently producing other things? How do you handle that argument? There's no divine ordinance that requires that we produce 50% of the world's steel if, let's say, we can produce 90% of the world's plastic more efficiently.
Big industry in the U.S. was devising its own solution to worsening economics. Steel manufacturing, car production were leaving the states where they had started decades before. Some factories moved to southern states where workers were not unionized. Other factories moved to Mexico or to Canada, even to Europe. And so the companies survived and profited. But the men and women who used to work in those giant plants, by the thousand, found themselves unemployed. The American working class in the 1970s had been offered no solutions to the rising inflation or the rising unemployment by the party of Roosevelt and Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. They were going to give Reagan and Reaganomics a try.
In a few days, the Congress will stand at the fork of two roads. One road is all too familiar to us. It leads ultimately to higher taxes. The other road promises to renew the American spirit. It's a road of hope and opportunity. It places the direction of your life back in your hands where it belongs.
1937, Roosevelt had raised the highest marginal income tax rate from 63% to 79%. That went on until 1945. Now think of this today, people. The highest marginal income tax rate was 94% in 1945. If you earned $1, God bless you, you were allowed to keep 6 cents of it.
We'll have no part of him.
The New Citizens Committee won't stand for it.
Fresh air, but it quickly devolved again. After Kennedy, there was what we called the Four Stooges, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, which was the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. Let me take you on honesty. From 1932, now I'm just going to talk the personal income tax, from 1932 until 1981, the highest income tax rate never went below 63%. Most of the time it was in the 90s. Can you believe that?
In 1980, the top 1% of Americans earned wages of about $110,000 a year. By 1990, after about 10 years of Reaganomics, boing, the top 1% had seen their wages rise by 80%. Trickle-down economics, though, right? What's good for the rich is good for all of us, right? Not quite. Here's the average wages of the rest of the country in 1980, and here's what happened for the rest of the country after about 10 years of Reaganomics. Flat. A whopping 3% rise in wages in 10 years.
Downtown Chicago is getting ready for the Christmas shopping season, but the merchants in one neighborhood, Inglewood, expect little Christmas business this year. Most of their customers are on public aid, which has been cut by the Reagan administration. At Judge Barber's furniture store, pre-Christmas sales have not attracted shoppers, and Barber blames Reaganomics.
The customers that are coming in are certainly less than those that were coming in before the economics of Mr. Reagan's took place.
But drawing support from demonstrators outside, but not from votes on the floor, Senate Democrats today lost an attempt to save the Social Security minimum retirement benefit. Even so, the issue is far from dead, as Phil Jones reports.
As all the voting was occurring today, senior citizens were gathering on the Capitol steps to protest Social Security cuts. But the protest had no effect on the Senate, which rejected by a vote of 52 to 46 an attempt to preserve the $122 a month minimum benefit, a benefit that President Reagan has suggested for elimination. A short time later, over in the House, the same issue. What about those 3 million who will be affected by elimination of the minimum benefits?
Among these are some of the oldest and the poorest in our society. They have nobody to protect them except the members of this Congress.
Was he got 11 tax brackets, brought them down to 2, lowered the rates on the highest, raised the rates on the lowest. Have you ever heard of a president and a bill passing that actually raises tax rates on the lowest income earners? Can you imagine that? He did that. I mean, it's just amazing.
This steel mill on the outskirts of Braddock, Pennsylvania is all that's left in a river valley that once hummed with the sounds of metal and money being made.
Steel meant everything to the area. It meant jobs. It meant a source of pride.
For a century, the Pittsburgh area was the steel capital of the world until the 1980s, when foreign competitors came up with revolutionary innovations and America's steel industry went bust.
This plant used to employ 2,500 people. What happened here in 1984 happened all across Pennsylvania's Monongahela Valley, leaving once thriving communities like Braddock clinging to life and worrying now the next closure could mean death.
This was the second Pittsburgh right here.
Ray Henderson lost his job when his mill closed, but that was only the beginning.
there were so many small plants that was connected to the steel industry. They went down also.
And when the jobs disappeared, the shops, the banks, the people disappeared too.
What is the Rust Belt? Let's clarify. The Rust Belt is a region that goes from central New York State to Wisconsin. The Rust Belt used to have most of the factories that produced steel and made cars in the U.S. Those factories were there because the Rust Belt is near the Great Lakes. But things changed and there was less and less work for those factories in the Rust Belt. In many places, companies decided to produce things in other countries because it was easier and cheaper than doing it in the United States.
General Motors confirmed it today. It is going to close plants employing almost 30,000 workers.
Today, we are announcing the closing of 11 of our older plants.
While Detroit and Pontiac will certainly be hurt by the shutdowns, the effect on Flint is absolutely devastating.
To start with, the whole struggle for tax reform in our country is a kind of drama with good guys and bad guys and even a damsel in distress. But like all dramas, it occurs in a certain context, and here's ours. Our economy, the American economy, has never been stronger, never been bigger, and never been better. Since the economic recovery began, we've created over 8 million new jobs.
What happened with the auto plant shutting down was a tragedy to this community, especially Pontiac, where I live. My city is just about gone now, and this was the major staple. I don't know where the people went. I know they're not here, and I know the businesses aren't here anymore, and it's terrible.
If you want to spot a trend, all you need to do is look at where the money is going.
For General Motors, $2.3 billion going to a new battery plant here in the United States. Now, it's not going to be built here in Metro Detroit. It's in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Business editor Rob Maloney shows us what it means, not just for the company, but for the industry as a whole.
Does Chattanooga actually have the workforce to support the plan? Now, the president of Chattanooga State says this announcement will test the community's readiness. WDEF News' Amanda Williams joins us now with that part of the story on what part local institutions will play.
Chattanooga State President Jim Catanzaro was at Eastgate this morning to celebrate the grand opening of an additional location, and that's when News 12 delivered the good news. Catanzaro says Chat State will play a major role in providing the workforce for this new plant. He says Volkswagen visited the campus several weeks ago to assess their capabilities. Now he cites Chattanooga's mature workforce that's ready to go when the plant opens.
The federal government spent most of its Cold War money on the defense and aerospace industries of the South, where everything was cheaper compared to the North. Workers could even be paid less, in part due to there being less labor unions in the South. The Sun Belt also received much more money than the North from the federal government in terms of military and aerospace spending. Oil boomed in Texas. Tourism obviously boomed pretty much everywhere in the Sun Belt. The creation of the interstate highway system in the 1950s opened up once isolated southern regions to the rest of the country. Southern governments offered incentives for businesses to move there.
And free trade. You know, it was Reagan who put through NAFTA. I don't know if any of you know that. We could not get it passed under Ronald Reagan. We just couldn't. The Republicans were probably primarily the problem at that time. But free trade is really, really, really important. I mean, there's some things we make better than foreigners. And there's some things foreigners make better than we do. We and they would be foolish in the extreme if we didn't sell them those products we make better than they do, in exchange for those products they make better than we do.
And those two lines tracked each other. Every time labor productivity went up about 3%, wages went up over 3%. Right? And so between the end of World War II and the mid-1970s, those two lines increased by almost exactly the same percentage, about 100%. Each person was making 100% more per hour and was getting paid 100% more per hour. Since the mid-1970s, labor productivity has kept going up almost the same rate as it was before the mid-70s. So it's now at about 250% higher than in 1950. Wages stopped growing in the mid-1970s. And so the average worker now is making about 100% more than they did in 1950, but they're producing about 250% more.
Why aren't workers sharing in the prosperity that they've helped create?
Well, that's exactly the problem. It used to be that when productivity went up, wages went up. Workers,
you work harder, you got more of the results of it.
You got the fair day's pay for the fair day's work, you got more results. You shared in the rise in worker productivity. Now almost all the rise in worker productivity is going not just to the upper class, but to the very top of the upper class. So,
what is the problem today?
The problem today is that inequality is at its highest that has been probably ever. And we have the greatest inequality in the developed world and the greatest immobility of our society. And people don't understand in America the depth of the problem. It's about people, it's about society, it's about lack of jobs, lack of education. It's a problem where 60% of all American homes have to borrow money at the end of each month.
General Motors México cuenta con una de las plantas más impresionantes del mundo. Ubicada en el estado de Guanajuato, el complejo de Silao produce 3 de las pick-ups más vendidas del mundo: Silverado, Cheyenne y Sierra.
Often described as a race to the bottom on wages, Mexico may instead represent a triple threat. Workers willing to work not just harder, but yes, for less pay. A place open to global trade, and one that is increasingly educated and highly skilled, and working hard to get even more so.
I'm a factory worker. I'm proud of it. I thought I was going to retire from GM, and it didn't work out that way.
We went to a meeting and seen on TV that they were shutting the plant down.
I had this vision of this big, gentle dragon taking its last breath.
I couldn't believe the reaction of the people. They're so proud of our work.
I know how much went into building a high-quality vehicle.
It's the family, it's the people, it's your friends.
And I love them all.
We spend thousands and thousands of dollars fighting wars in other countries. Let's take care of our own people here.
If we go back into negotiations and the FAA does not budge, I think that we'll have to strike.
This was potentially a destructive decision, as it put them directly in the line of termination.
Striking by federal employees is illegal and always has been.
However, PATCO took inspiration from previous public strikes.
Millions of public workers engaged in this great wave of strike activity. Teachers, sanitation workers engaged in this strike wave where they rejected this idea that they should not have the basic human right to strike, and they struck anyway.
It became a matter of principle for air traffic controllers around the country. They wanted to retire from their jobs safely before stress burnt them out, and they felt they were not given the support that would ever make that possible.
Fed up with low wages and long shifts, 15,000 of America's air traffic controllers walk off their jobs, paralyzing the nation.
Our people are firm. Our people are solid. We'd rather face this issue right now. I thank every controller in this country who stood by us.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike.
15 minutes later, he was in the Rose Garden reading his yellow pad. That became the policy.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
The share of workers in the U.S. who belong to a labor union, like I do, has fallen to around 10%. If you take out the government employees, it's 6%. And have you ever been part of a union? It sounds like you haven't.
No, I haven't. What got me interested in the question was just the recent news, especially around Starbucks.
Starbucks workers in upstate New York,
Santa Cruz,
Philadelphia,
Mesa, Arizona, more than 20, 30, 100,
200 Starbucks locations
voted in favor of joining a union so far.
Unions have been catching some momentum here in the U.S. And if we can make sense of the historical decline, we might understand what it would take to reverse it.
While President Clinton eventually lifted the federal ban on the PATCO strikers in 1993, Reagan's termination and replacement approach, as opposed to further negotiating with the strikers, set a historic precedent for employers.
This was a major event. I mean, this is an event where Ronald Reagan and the federal government were drawing a line in the sand with the labor movement.
And that turned this labor conflict into something different from any other labor conflict that had preceded it. They were replaced en masse all of them.
But this also indicates to private business that this is a tactic that works and that it's something that they can use as well.
It gave employers an incredible sense of power and control.
It definitely had, as Reagan would probably like to hear, trickle-down effects. We haven't seen any type of labor dispute on that level since.
Public employee strikes plummeted. Private sector unions faced a horrible period of union busting.
Many employers decided to get tough with unions and break union strikes using strike breakers themselves. They were basically following on Reagan's coattails.
2 airplanes went in the past 10-15 minutes, so you can expect to go in as an uncontrolled airport.
Is there a reason it's not manned?
Well, I'm going to take a guess and say that the controller got locked out. I've heard of this happening before.
That's the first time I've heard it.
That was the conversation between an American Airlines flight and a controller who is responsible for a wider geographical area, Potomac Control. Apparently, the only air traffic controller in the actual tower at Reagan National Airport was not locked out. Reportedly, that controller was asleep. Well, luckily, that plane and another one actually landed safely. How could this happen at a major airport serving our nation's capital?
Maybe the guy was having a health problem.
Yeah,
who knows?
And what about just the idea of having one person on duty? What does that say? Does that have something to do with budget cuts?
Well, that's a concern. My old agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, has had a concern about one-man towers because you really do, particularly at our nation's capital, you really do want two people in the tower at all times.
Yeah.
Interests are, of course, the trade unions, the monopolistic craft trade unions in particular. The do-gooders believe that by passing a law saying that nobody shall get less than $2 an hour or $2.50 an hour or whatever the minimum wage is, you are helping poor people who need the money. You are doing nothing of the kind. What you are doing is to assure that people whose skills are not sufficient to justify that kind of a wage will be unemployed.
So what happened with America's unions? Were they good for America's economy? Were they bad? Where do they stand?
They made labor too expensive. And that didn't matter when we had no competition. When we began to have competition, the unions were indeed very powerful. They did indeed push up wages, and they made our automobiles uncompetitive.
Bottom line, we can't protect these entitlements and also have the national defense we need to protect us in a dangerous world while we're at war.
The left primarily argues, well, no, Social Security isn't bankrupt. Look, bankrupt, Neil, as you well know, is when you can't pay your debts. You can get around it, I suppose, by paying people less than they're due on Social Security, by raising the retirement age. Those are all changes. It's like renegotiating with the bank when you can't pay your mortgage. But the bottom line is, once they've exhausted the trust fund, then all they have, as Hadley said, is an aging population not supported by the number of workers out there. You have a bankrupt Social Security and Medicare.
Ever since President Reagan presented his plan for rescuing the troubled Social Security system a month ago, people have been talking. The 23 million Americans now living in retirement say their benefits are being eaten up by inflation and they can't afford any cuts. Workers contemplating retirement are asking whether they can afford it. Young workers are asking if Social Security will be there when they retire. The administration says drastic action is needed now, but members of Congress are rebelling against parts of the president's plan. Today, Social Security funds disability benefits, old age medical care, and a variety of other benefits. The money received by individual beneficiaries has also increased steadily. In 1972, Congress tied benefits to inflation. Every time the cost of living went up, so did Social Security payments. And to pay for the increased benefits, we have had to pay higher Social Security taxes. Today, we pay 6.65% of the first $29,700 in income to Social Security. Half of us now pay more in Social Security taxes than income tax. Social Security taxes are scheduled for another increase in 1984. But that still isn't enough to adequately fund Social Security. This year, the system will pay out more than $160 billion in benefits. Health and Human Services Secretary Richard Schweiker says that rate of expenditure will mean trouble soon, and if nothing is done, the system will go broke as early as the fall of 1982.
For nearly 11 million Americans, including more than 1 million veterans and almost 2 million children who rely on this program to get the nutrition that they need to heat their homes and to pay for their medicine. This is a program that impacts, quite honestly, some of the very most vulnerable people in this country. And let me be very clear in describing this program that this is a program that American workers have paid into. It is an insurance program. This is not charity. When Americans pay 6.2% of their income in the payroll tax, almost 1% of that amount goes into the disability insurance program. The average disability insurance benefit is less than $1,200 a month. And for 30% of beneficiaries, this is all of the income that they have. Nobody is getting rich off of disability benefits. Sadly, on the very first day of the new Congress, House Republicans passed a rule that would lay the groundwork for a 19% cut in Social Security disability insurance benefits.
In health news, a fiery discussion led by Connecticut Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on the ongoing impact of cuts in the United Healthcare Medicare Advantage program.
More than 2,000 doctors in healthcare facilities were just dropped from that list of providers caring for seniors right here in our state. Well, News 8's medical reporter Jocelyn Momenta has been following this story from the very beginning and has more tonight on what steps a congresswoman plans to take.
These seniors did not hold back their frustration at this fact-finding discussion held by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro.
No one can get an answer.
They didn't give you any indication that anything like that was changing.
If you have a traditional job making $50,000, you pay 6.2% of your salary or $3,100 a year in Social Security taxes. That number is then matched by your employer. Now, Social Security takes your top 35 earning years, adjusts them for inflation, adds them all together, then divides that number by 420, or the number of months in 35 years. That gives you $4,196. Still with me? That figure gives you your average indexed monthly earnings, or AIME.
The system is heading for a train wreck.
But you want a little nuance there. All right. Alan?
It depends on what you mean by crisis. The problem gets worse every year. And if we don't deal with it now, some people may be dead when we deal with it, but those who aren't dead will have a much heavier price to pay.
Okay.
The benefits currently are relatively modest in size. They're lower relative to earnings than they have been in the past and are scheduled under current law to go down, and they are very modest compared to the benefits paid in other developed nations.
The trustees for Medicare and Social Security, of which I used to be one, say Medicare will run out of money by 2026, 3 years sooner than last projected, and Social Security will run out in 2034. But this doesn't have to be the case. Here are 3 easy fixes to Social Security and Medicare that Republicans don't want you to know about. First, raise the cap on income subject to Social Security payroll taxes. This year, that cap is $128,400, meaning that every dollar earned above $128,400 isn't subject to Social Security taxes. So the typical CEO of a big company who makes over $15 million pays Social Security taxes on just $128,400 of his or her income, a tiny fraction, while the typical nurse practitioner who takes home around $100,000 pays Social Security taxes on every dollar of his or her income. In this era of raging inequality, that's not fair, and it's not even logical. So the first fix is to raise the cap on income subject to Social Security taxes.
Right now, you pay 12.4% of earnings up to a cap of $90,000. That is split between employee and employer, but no taxes are collected on any earnings over $90,000 per person.
Now, the income cap on the payroll tax has risen slowly since 1982.
indexed to average earnings. If earnings continue to rise, as in the past, the cap would rise, but not nearly enough to keep pace with projected Social Security benefits. Removing the cap entirely, thereby imposing a flat tax of 12.4% on all earnings, essentially a $100 billion a year tax increase on the wealthy, would more than completely close the funding gap. Even lifting the cap today to, say, $150,000 by using a different index would solve more than half the problem. But such calculations beg the question: why was there a cap in the first place? Raising the income tax cap on Social Security seemed an obvious solution.
There shouldn't be a cap on it. Everyone should pay. Up as high as long as you're making the money, you should have to pay on it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes, of course.
But a CNN USA Today Gallup poll in February found that 2/3 of Americans supported applying a Social Security tax on all income. And at Columbia, folks who will obviously be affected by a rise in the tax cap supported it almost as enthusiastically as those out on the street.
How many people are in favor of at least raising the cap to 150?
Well, I have no issue returning to something that looks like the system of taxation under Eisenhower or under, presidents in the 60s or 70s.
And how much would that be?
I would like to, well, it's somewhere between about 60% and 80% for people who make an incredible amount of money. So for the top 1%, I would like to see them taxed at a much higher rate because they can afford to pay it.
60 to 80%, right off the top. Take it off you. Economist Brian Westbury is with us. What would a 60 to 80% tax rate do to the economy?
Stuart, it would be awful.
The rise of inequality is a specific historical period. It starts in the late 1970s. It really it reaches a peak around 2000.
But back in 1980, when I was running for president, it was all so different.
I'm gonna find a way out of here.
You can't.